My brother blamed me for ruining his life, but the real culprit was closer than he thought. I'm a 29-year-old woman, and my younger brother Oliver is 26. We were close as kids, but things changed as we got older. It was never outright hostility, just this underlying tension that neither of us ever addressed. He always seemed to be measuring himself against me even when I wasn't trying to compete. I did well in school, landed a solid job as a software engineer, and built a stable life. Oliver, on the other hand, struggled. He bounced between jobs, had a series of failed relationships, and never quite found his footing. Our parents, without meaning to, made things worse by constantly comparing him to me. I never asked for it, but that didn't matter. Oliver saw me as the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in their eyes. Things really took a turn when Oliver got engaged to his longtime girlfriend, Rachel. Our parents were thrilled, and even though Oliver and I weren't exactly on the best terms, I genuinely hoped he found someone who made him happy. Rachel was charismatic, always had a smooth answer for everything, and knew how to work a room, but something about her felt off. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia or maybe just me being overly critical because of my protectiveness toward Oliver. But then the little inconsistencies started piling up. During a family dinner, Rachel was going on about her business, something vague about being an entrepreneur in tech. She threw around buzzwords, talked about investments, and claimed she'd built her company from the ground up. It all sounded impressive on the surface, but when I asked more pointed questions, her answers were slippery. She avoided specifics, redirected the conversation, or just laughed it off. I work in tech, so I know what a genuine entrepreneur sounds like, and Rachel wasn't it. At first, I kept my concerns to myself. I figured maybe I was being too skeptical. Maybe I just didn't like the woman, and I didn't want to stir up drama if there wasn't a real reason to. But the more I thought about it, the less it sat right with me. One night, I started digging. Just basic online searches at first, company records, social media, anything that could confirm her story. But what I found only made me more suspicious. Her business had no verifiable presence, no website, no LinkedIn, nothing solid. Her supposed company existed only in vague mentions, but had no actual footprint. That's when I decided to confront her directly. I caught her alone after another family gathering, laid out what I'd found, and asked her to explain. Her reaction was instant. No defensiveness, no attempt to clear up the confusion, just a smirk and a warning to mind my own business. That was all I needed to hear. I knew Oliver wouldn't believe me if I just came to him with half-baked suspicions. At first, I tried looking into her myself, public records, company registrations, and anything I could find online. When I still had doubts, I consulted a friend in the industry who advised me to dig deeper. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator to confirm what I was already beginning to suspect. The investigator worked fast, and within a couple of weeks, I had a report in my hands that made my stomach drop. Rachel had multiple aliases. She'd been involved in fraudulent businesses, scamming investors, and skipping town before facing consequences. She was buried in debt, and if she had any real income, it wasn't coming from legitimate sources. Now I had a real problem. I had proof, but delivering it to Oliver without him immediately dismissing me as jealous or controlling was going to be next to impossible. Still, I had to try. I invited him over, told him I had something important to talk about. He was already on edge before I even said anything, like he expected me to ruin his happiness. I handed him the investigator's report, let him read through it, and waited for it to sink in. It didn't. He barely skimmed it before pushing it back at me, shaking his head. He didn't want to hear it, didn't want to believe it. Instead, he accused me of trying to sabotage his relationship, of always thinking I knew better, of not wanting him to be happy. I tried to keep my voice calm, tried to explain that I wasn't doing this to hurt him, but he was already too far gone, too wrapped up in whatever spell Rachel had over him. When our parents found out, they were shocked but hesitant. They read the report, saw the evidence, but their reaction was mild. They didn't want to confront Oliver too harshly, didn't want to push him away. They thought he'd come to his senses eventually. Rachel, of course, played it perfectly. She painted me as the overprotective, controlling sister who couldn't stand seeing her brother happy. She convinced Oliver that I was just trying to manipulate him, that I was trying to break them up out of some twisted need to keep him beneath me. Whatever lies she told, he believed them, and that was it. He cut me off completely, blocked me on everything. Went through with the wedding, ignoring every single warning. Months passed, and Oliver stuck to his decision. He blocked me on everything and refused to acknowledge my existence. Any attempt to reach out was ignored. Our parents tried to keep the family together, but it was clear Oliver wanted nothing to do with me. They were heartbroken but hesitant to push too hard, afraid that if they pressed him, he'd cut them off too. I let it go. I had done everything I could. The wedding planning moved forward. Though Oliver had cut me off, I still heard bits and pieces from relatives who kept me in the loop. His social media, which I could no longer see directly, was being shown to me by family members who hadn't been blocked. If anyone in the family had doubts, they kept them to themselves. Oliver made it clear I wasn't welcome, and I didn't fight it. Then out of nowhere, I got a message. It came from a private account with no name, no profile picture. I was skeptical at first, but after some back and forth, the sender provided old messages and photos proving she had been involved with Rachel before. The message was brief but disturbing. The sender claimed to be one of Rachel's exes and warned me that Oliver was making a huge mistake. She said Rachel was a career scam artist, that she had done this before, swept men off their feet, drained their finances, and disappeared. She didn't give specifics, just enough to make it clear she had personal experience. I tried verifying her identity, but there was nothing to go on. I debated whether to ignore it or act. But in the end, I forwarded the message to my parents. I wasn't going to reach out to Oliver directly. I already knew how that would go, but I hoped they would at least try. They did. They asked Oliver to meet them for dinner and gently brought up their concerns again. They weren't aggressive, didn't push too hard, just told him they had heard something troubling, and wanted him to be sure about Rachel before he committed to her legally. That was all it took for him to snap. He accused them of conspiring with me, of trying to sabotage his life. He said they were either with him or against him, and if they didn't stop, he would cut them off too. The wedding went on as planned. I wasn't there, but my cousin was. She messaged me throughout the day, keeping me updated. The ceremony was lavish, exactly the kind of over-the-top event Oliver had always dreamed of. Everything was running smoothly until it wasn't. Just days before the wedding, I heard from a relative that law enforcement had been investigating Rachel. It wasn't until after the ceremony, while guests were celebrating at the reception, that officers quietly arrived and pulled Rachel aside for questioning before placing her under arrest. At first, people thought it was some kind of mistake, but then they put her in handcuffs. Rachel didn't resist. She didn't argue. She just smirked like she had seen this coming. The guests were in shock. Oliver was frozen in place. His face drained of color. The chaos that followed was instant. Guests started whispering. Some took out their phones. Someone recorded the whole thing, and within hours, the video was everywhere. Oliver standing in his wedding suit, watching as his fiancée was dragged away. It didn't take long for the details to surface. Fraud, multiple counts, all tied to Rachel's shady business dealings. Oliver didn't call me. He didn't reach out to our parents. Instead, he blamed them. He told everyone that they had helped me ruin his life, that they had been working against him from the start. He refused to admit he had been scammed. With Rachel gone, reality started closing in. The debts, the wedding bills, the public humiliation, it was all on him now. With Rachel in jail, Oliver was left to deal with the mess she had created. The wedding bills alone were staggering. Thousands of dollars spent on a lavish event that had ended in public humiliation. Vendors still expected payment, and with Rachel gone, all those financial obligations fell on him. The venue, the catering, the decorations, none of it could be undone. On top of that, the video of Rachel's arrest had gone viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. Strangers online picked apart every detail, dissecting his reaction, his blind trust, his refusal to listen to the warnings. Instead of taking accountability, Oliver doubled down. He spun a different version of events, claiming he had been set up. The story he told was that I had always been out to get him, that I couldn't stand seeing him happy, and that I had worked with the authorities to sabotage his wedding day. It didn't matter that Rachel's arrest had nothing to do with me. It was easier for him to place the blame on me than to admit he had been deceived. Some distant relatives bought into it, siding with him out of sympathy, but most people saw through it. Our parents, already exhausted from trying to reason with him, stopped entertaining the excuses. For years, they had walked on eggshells around Oliver, always trying to keep the peace, always making excuses for his behavior. But this time was different. They didn't cut him off, but they also didn't offer the kind of unconditional support he was expecting. No financial bailouts. No pretending that what happened was my fault. They told him he needed to figure this out on his own. Without their help, he turned to extended family. He reached out to aunts, uncles, and even family friends, hoping to find someone willing to support him through what he called a betrayal. But sympathy only went so far. The truth was out in the open. Rachel was a scammer, and Oliver had ignored every warning. People listened, nodded, offered words of encouragement, but few were willing to involve themselves beyond that. The money he was hoping for never came, then came the biggest blow. The scandal affected his career. His employer, a mid-sized marketing firm, didn't want to be associated with someone whose name was circulating in the worst possible way. He wasn't fired outright, but it was made clear that his presence was a distraction. Clients who had seen the viral wedding disaster asked questions. Within a month, he lost his job. It wasn't until a lawyer contacted me that I learned the full extent of Rachel's deception. She had been using Oliver, not just for his money, but as part of a larger scheme. Marriage had never been her end goal. She had been setting things up to use his credit, his accounts, and his connections. The moment she had enough, she would have disappeared. Just like she had done before with other men, Oliver wasn't just collateral damage. He had been a target. When the weight of it all finally became too much, Oliver showed up at our parents' house. It had been months since he had spoken to them, and he looked completely drained. He wasn't there to argue. He was desperate. He had no job, no money, no place to turn. He wanted their help, and for the first time, he didn't demand it. He pleaded. I happened to be there at the time, visiting. It was the first time I had seen him in person since the wedding. He barely looked at me at first, as if acknowledging me would force him to admit that I had been right. When he finally did, it wasn't to apologize, it was to accuse. He still saw me as the one who had ruined his life, the one who had interfered instead of letting him make his own choices. I didn't argue. I just told him the truth. As long as he kept blaming everyone else, he was going to keep making the same mistakes. He didn't respond. He just walked out. But for the first time, he didn't immediately lash out online. No dramatic posts. No attempts to turn the family against me. Just silence. A few days later, I got a message from an unknown number. It was Oliver. He wanted to talk. Oliver's message had been short, just a request to meet. No explanation, no apology, nothing to suggest he had changed his perspective. Still, I agreed. We met at a small cafe, neutral ground, with the hope that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to acknowledge reality. The moment he sat down, it became clear that wasn't the case. He looked exhausted, but there was no regret in his expression, only resentment. He launched straight into it, blaming me for everything that had gone wrong in his life. According to him, Rachel had been the only person who truly cared about him, the only one who ever put him first. He insisted that I had ruined his wedding, destroyed his reputation, and left him with nothing. I didn't argue. There was no point. But then he dropped something unexpected. He had been in contact with Rachel, not just once or twice. He had been speaking to her regularly, visiting her in jail. He believed she had been wrongly accused, that she had been set up. And, of course, he was convinced I had something to do with it. That was the moment I knew he hadn't learned anything. Everything Rachel had done, all the evidence against her, everything she had put him through, it didn't matter. He still believed the version of events that let him be the victim of some grand conspiracy instead of someone who had ignored every warning sign. I left the cafe without bothering to argue. There was nothing I could say that would change his mind. When I told our parents, they were stunned. They had assumed Oliver had finally understood what had happened, that he had come to them for help because he realized he had been manipulated, but that wasn't it at all. He was still clinging to the fantasy that Rachel was innocent and that everyone who had tried to warn him was just out to ruin his life. Then came the real reason he had reached out: money. Oliver was drowning in debt from the wedding and job loss. The lavish event he and Rachel had thrown wasn't fully paid off. And now, with no job and no support, the bills were piling up. He wanted financial help, and when our parents refused, he snapped. He stormed out of their house, saying they were no better than me, that none of us ever truly cared about him. He vowed to never speak to them again. At first, I thought that was the end of it. But then, a cousin reached out with news. Oliver had been spreading lies, telling family members that I had falsified evidence against Rachel. He claimed I had worked with the authorities to frame her, that I had used my job in tech to hack information against her. Some distant relatives, ones who didn't know the full story, believed him. I had to do damage control, explaining what had actually happened, but there were still a few people who remained skeptical. Oliver wasn't just cutting himself off from the family. He was actively trying to turn people against me. Then the final blow came. I found out Oliver had co-signed an apartment lease with Rachel before the wedding. She had, of course, stopped paying her share long before her arrest. Now the property owner was coming after him for unpaid rent, and he was being sued. The amount wasn't small, and with no job, no savings, and no family willing to fund his delusions, he was out of options. A week later, I got the call. Oliver was desperate. He needed money, needed someone to bail him out, but I knew how this would go. If I helped him now, he would keep finding ways to avoid taking responsibility. He wasn't looking to change. He was looking for someone to clean up the mess for him. I refused. He exploded, accused me of being heartless, of turning my back on family, but I didn't budge. When he realized I wasn't going to give in, he blocked me. Our parents tried to reach out one last time, but he ignored them. And just like that, he was gone. After Oliver blocked me and cut off our parents, he disappeared completely. No calls, no updates, nothing. The only thing anyone knew was that he had moved in with a friend, someone outside the family, someone who still believed his version of events. He refused to acknowledge any of the people who had tried to help him. Weeks passed, and then I got a message, not from Oliver, but from his friend. It was short, just a few sentences, but enough to raise alarm bells. Oliver had been drinking heavily, spiraling deeper into denial, and still writing letters to Rachel in jail. He was convinced she would be released soon and that they would reunite. He had even started talking about marrying her once she was cleared of the false charges. Meanwhile, the legal issues surrounding the unpaid rent escalated. The property owner had moved forward with court proceedings, and Oliver was now facing significant legal fees on top of everything else. With no job and no stable income, he had no way of paying. The reality of his financial situation should have forced him to finally accept the truth, but instead, he came up with a new plan. He launched an online fundraiser. The fundraiser painted him as the victim of a massive betrayal. He wrote about how his wedding had been sabotaged, how his family had abandoned him, and how he was now facing legal trouble because of things outside his control. He never mentioned Rachel by name, just vaguely referenced someone he trusted who had been wrongfully accused. The story was crafted perfectly. Enough truth to make it sound believable, but enough distortion to make himself seem completely blameless. At first, I ignored it. But then, I found out some of our distant relatives had donated. A few extended family members, the kind who weren't in the loop about everything that had happened, saw his fundraiser and felt sorry for him. They sent him money, believing he was genuinely in crisis. Then someone unexpected reached out, Rachel's ex-fiancé. He had seen the fundraiser and recognized the patterns. He told Oliver that he had been exactly where he was now, defending Rachel, believing her lies, isolating himself from family. He told Oliver to wake up before it was too late. Oliver dismissed him completely, called him bitter, called him jealous, refused to even consider that this man might be trying to help him. That was my breaking point. I had stayed quiet long enough. If Oliver wanted to ruin his own life, that was his choice. But now, he was actively deceiving people and using their money to continue living in denial. I decided enough was enough. I gathered everything: legal records, court documents, news articles on Rachel's past scams. I compiled the details of her fraud, her history of using men, and how she had done this before. Then I sent it to every single person who had donated to Oliver's fundraiser. The backlash was immediate. People demanded refunds. Some even reported his fundraiser for fraud. It wasn't long before the platform took it down entirely. Then Oliver found out what I had done. He exploded online, posted dramatic messages about backstabbing family and narcissists who enjoy ruining lives. He refused to admit he had been caught. He made vague threats about how karma would come for me. But while he was busy blaming me, something else was happening behind his back. Rachel was already moving on. I got confirmation through a mutual connection that Rachel had been writing love letters to another man. Even from jail, she was still running the same script, still manipulating someone else. Oliver had no idea. He was still clinging to the belief that she was the only one who had ever truly loved him. And then, the last message came. It was from Oliver. No anger, no begging, just one sentence. I hope you are happy now. You finally won. Then he vanished from social media completely. Weeks passed, and Oliver completely vanished. No posts, no updates, nothing. He had deleted all his social media accounts, cut off the few remaining friends who had still been in contact with him, and seemed to have disappeared entirely. Even the relatives who had once defended him had no idea where he was. Our parents, despite everything, started to worry. They had been firm about not enabling him anymore, but he was still their son. They reached out to anyone who might know where he had gone. Old friends, past co-workers, even his former landlord. No one had any answers. His phone was disconnected, and every attempt to track him down led to a dead end. Then one evening, I got a call from an unknown number. It was a detective. Oliver had been arrested. I didn't get all the details at first, just that he had been caught attempting wire fraud. I drove straight to our parents' house to tell them. They were shocked, but not entirely surprised. They had hoped Oliver would finally take responsibility for his life, but instead, he had escalated things to an entirely new level. It didn't take long for the full story to come out. Desperate and out of options, Oliver tried to access an account Rachel had previously controlled, unaware that it had already been flagged by the authorities. He submitted documents falsely claiming he had legal access, but the bank immediately detected discrepancies and alerted law enforcement. The bank flagged it immediately, and he was arrested on the spot. And then came the final blow. Rachel had turned on him. To reduce her own sentence, she testified that Oliver had been fully aware of her scams, that he had helped her manage accounts, and that he had even participated in some of her schemes before her arrest. Whether or not that was true didn't even matter. Rachel was cutting all ties to him, leaving him to deal with the consequences alone. That was the moment Oliver finally realized the truth. He had thrown away his entire life for a woman who had never cared about him. The court hearing was scheduled quickly. I went with our parents, not because I felt any obligation to Oliver, but because I needed to see how this all played out. When Oliver was brought into the courtroom, he looked different. The arrogance, the defiance, it was gone. He wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. Least of all me. The lawyer assigned to his case argued that he had been manipulated, that he was just another victim of Rachel's web of lies. The prosecutors, however, were pushing for jail time. Our mother, despite everything Oliver had put her through, pleaded with the judge for leniency. She couldn't bear the thought of her son behind bars, no matter how much he had messed up. Then came Rachel's turn. She appeared via video call, initially trying to charm her way out of it, claiming she was misunderstood. But when questioned further, she shifted the blame onto Oliver, distancing herself from any responsibility. She had already moved on. Oliver was just another name in a long list of people she had used and discarded. That was the moment Oliver finally broke. He turned to me, his voice shaking, and admitted that I had been right all along, that he had been blind, that he should have listened. I didn't respond. I couldn't tell if his words were sincere or just another attempt to manipulate the situation. In the end, Oliver was sentenced to probation and community service. The judge made it clear, any further fraudulent activity would result in immediate jail time. As part of his probation, he was legally required to cease all contact with Rachel. If he tried to reach out to her, he would be in violation of the court's order. As we left the courthouse, I stopped one last time and told him, simply, that I hoped he actually learned from this. He didn't respond, but just as I turned to leave, I heard him mutter under his breath, "This is not over." Weeks passed without any word from Oliver. No outbursts, no desperate pleas for money, nothing. It was almost as if he had vanished again, but this time, I didn't try to find out where he had gone. Our parents, however, still held on to hope. They believed that after everything, he might finally be turning his life around. Then out of nowhere, our mother called me, sounding hesitant. Oliver had resurfaced. Not just that, he wanted to meet. It wasn't an apology, not even an attempt at reconciliation. Instead, he invited me to dinner at a high-end restaurant in the city. The location alone made me suspicious. Oliver had been drowning in debt, barely avoiding jail time, and now he was dining at one of the most expensive spots in town. I agreed to go, but only to see what this was all about. When I arrived, Oliver was already there, sitting at a table near the window. But the person in front of me wasn't the Oliver I had last seen in court. He looked polished, confident. Designer suit, expensive watch, flawless hair. There was no trace of the desperation or exhaustion that had been there just weeks ago. He smiled like he had won some sort of invisible battle, as if everything that had happened was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Then came the big reveal. He had a new girlfriend, Marcia. According to Oliver, she was successful in helping him rebuild his life. But when I pressed for details, he was vague. I later found out that he had taken out loans in his name, which might explain his sudden lifestyle shift. He didn't just stop there. He bragged about moving into a high-rise apartment, the luxurious gifts she had showered him with, the exclusive parties she had taken him to. It all sounded too familiar. I asked how he had turned his life around so quickly. He waved it off, saying he had been lucky, that everything had just fallen into place. The more he talked, the more red flags appeared. Oliver wasn't working. He had no job, no income of his own. Everything, the apartment, the expensive clothes, The restaurant bill was being covered by Marcia. I went home that night knowing something wasn't right. The situation mirrored exactly what had happened with Rachel, Oliver, jumping headfirst into another relationship, relying completely on a woman to fix his problems. But this time, he was being even more reckless, as if he had learned nothing from what happened before. I decided to look into Marcia. A simple search told me enough. Her name wasn't as spotless as Oliver made it seem. There were traces of lawsuits, unpaid debts, and a long history of ex-boyfriends who had accused her of financial manipulation. Then someone reached out. A friend who had heard Oliver's name mentioned in certain circles. They told me Marcia had a pattern. She targeted financially vulnerable men, love-bombed them, and once she had control, drained them dry before moving on. I warned our parents. They wanted to believe Oliver had truly changed, that maybe, just maybe, this was the fresh start he needed. I told them to be cautious. Meanwhile, Oliver was all over social media again, flooding his pages with pictures of his new perfect life. Expensive vacations, gifts, dinners. If anyone didn't know his history, they would have assumed he was doing better than ever. Then I received a cryptic message from an unknown number. Your brother has no idea what he's getting into. That was it. No explanation. No follow-up. When I tried to respond, the number was already disconnected. I knew I couldn't just ignore this. I started digging deeper into Marcia's past, trying to find something, anything, that might wake Oliver up before it was too late. But when I tried to warn him, he laughed it off, told me I was jealous, that I couldn't stand seeing him happy. Then, just like before, he blocked me. This time, I knew there would be no second chances. If he was going to get hurt again, I couldn't stop it, but I wasn't going to sit back and do nothing. I just had to find another way to protect him. Digging into Marcia's past didn't take long. Her name was attached to multiple fraud lawsuits, financial disputes, and accusations from former boyfriends. Her pattern was clear. She targeted financially vulnerable men, love-bombed them with extravagant gestures, then slowly drained their finances before moving on. I reached out to one of her exes. He responded almost immediately and agreed to meet. He didn't hesitate to tell his story. Marcia always presented herself as a wealthy businesswoman, promising a life of luxury. She made men feel special, convinced them they were her partner in everything, including business. Then she would persuade them to take out loans, co-sign apartments, or invest in ventures that never existed. By the time they realized what was happening, she had moved on, leaving them with a financial mess. Then came the worst part. Oliver had already taken out a loan in his name. One Marcia claimed was for a business investment. He had fallen right into the same trap, I told our parents. They were alarmed but hesitant to intervene. The last time they tried to warn Oliver, he had shut them out completely. But this wasn't just about him anymore. If Marcia drained him financially, he would be left with nothing, possibly even in legal trouble again. Then I received a message from Marcia herself. Instead of outright threats, she was playing mind games, implying that Oliver had told her things about me, that I should be careful who I trust. It was a classic manipulation tactic. I ignored it, but it only confirmed what I already knew. Marcia was feeling the pressure. I needed Oliver to hear the truth from someone he couldn't dismiss as jealous or out to ruin his happiness. So I set up a meeting between him and one of Marcia's former victims. I didn't tell him who he was meeting until he arrived. Oliver was furious at first, accusing me of digging up lies and trying to control his life. But then Marcia made a mistake. She had always claimed to own a specific company, one that supposedly made her millions. I had proof that the business had been dissolved years ago. I showed Oliver the documents, the records that exposed her lie. He went silent. For the first time, he wasn't arguing, wasn't making excuses. Later that night, Oliver confronted Marcia. From what I heard, it didn't go well. She tried to gaslight him, accusing him of listening to people who want to see him fail, but the cracks in her story were too big to ignore now. Marcia left before he could throw her out, but she didn't just disappear quietly, she retaliated. Within days, Oliver's name was being dragged through the mud online. Fake accounts spread rumors about him being unstable, a liar, someone who had used Marcia for money. She painted herself as the victim, twisting the story to make it seem like he was the manipulator. It was humiliating, but Oliver didn't fight back. He was emotionally drained, finally realizing that he had been wrong. Again, then late one night, I got a message from him. You were right. Oliver finally reached out, not through a cryptic message or a dramatic outburst, but with a simple request to meet. This time, he didn't set up a fancy dinner or try to act like everything was fine. Instead, he asked to meet at our parents' house. When I arrived, he was already sitting with them in the living room. No designer clothes, no forced confidence, just him, looking exhausted but real. For the first time in years, he didn't look like he was trying to prove something. He admitted everything. He acknowledged that he had ignored every warning, dismissed the people who truly cared about him, and hurt his own family in the process. He didn't try to make excuses or shift the blame this time. He knew he had made mistake after mistake, and it had nearly ruined him. Then came the hard truth. His financial situation was even worse than he had let on. The debts from Rachel's wedding disaster, the loans he had taken out with Marcia, and the legal fees from his attempted fraud case had left him with almost nothing. If he had stayed with Marcia any longer, he knew he would have lost even more. But the difference now was that he wasn't asking for a bailout. He didn't beg for money or try to guilt anyone into fixing his problems. He just laid it all out and admitted that he had done this to himself. He told us he had cut all ties with Marcia and had deleted every message, call log, and contact information from both her and Rachel. There was no going back this time. Rachel had taken a plea deal and was now serving time in prison. He hadn't spoken to her in months, and he had no intention of ever reaching out again. For the first time, he truly seemed to understand the damage he had done, not just to himself, but to everyone around him. I told him I would help him get back on track, but only if he took full responsibility for his choices. No more blaming others, no more expecting someone else to fix things. If he wanted to move forward, he had to do the work himself. He agreed. He started therapy, something he had always dismissed before. He admitted that he had a pattern of trusting the wrong people and pushing away the ones who actually cared about him. He needed to figure out why he kept making the same mistakes. We took things slow. I wasn't about to forget everything that had happened overnight, and I made it clear that there had to be boundaries. But little by little, we started rebuilding our relationship. Then Oliver did something I never expected. He made a public post, not an attack. Not a vague statement, blaming everyone else, but a real honest message taking full accountability for his actions. He admitted that he had made terrible choices, that he had let himself be manipulated, and that he had hurt people who had only tried to help him. It wasn't for sympathy or attention. It was just the truth. He moved back to our hometown, far away from the toxic people who had fueled his worst decisions. For the first time in years, family gatherings felt peaceful again. There was no tension, no underlying drama, just normal conversations without the fear of someone blowing up. The real test came a few weeks later. Oliver received a message from an unknown number, another shady woman, offering a business opportunity using the same smooth-talking approach that had trapped him before. This time, he didn't hesitate. He blocked her immediately. Then one evening, as we sat on our parents' porch, watching the sunset, he turned to me and simply said, "Thank you, not just for saving him from Marcia, but for standing by him even when he had done nothing to deserve it." For the first time in years, I felt like I had my brother back.